question 102.
The Taxi Bill 2012, published last December, is a major step in the process of implementing the recommendations of the Taxi Regulation Review report published earlier that year. In line with the recommendations of the review report, the bill restates and strengthens the proportionality of the existing legislative provision for mandatory disqualification of persons convicted of serious criminal offences from operating in the industry. The provisions of the bill will ensure that those with convictions on indictment for the most serious of violent crimes will be excluded from the industry. The specification of offences to which mandatory disqualification applies is based on the principle of ensuring the welfare and the safety of passengers, particularly in situations where a passenger is travelling alone in a taxi. Because of the serious consequences of mandatory disqualification, it can only be applied in narrowly defined circumstances relating to very serious crimes. Furthermore, there are inbuilt safeguards in the bill to ensure that the effect is not disproportionate. Specifically, there is a right of appeal under which the appropriate court can review a range of matters pertinent to the suitability of the applicant to be a taxi driver. The bill was the subject of consultation with the government departments, including the Department of Justice and Equality, prior to its publication in December of last year. In addition, there was a representative of that department on the Taxi Regulation Review Group. During the course of preparation of the Review Group report of the bill, the issue of the Good Friday Agreement did not receive any special attention. I do not consider that it would be appropriate to include any particular reference to that agreement in the bill. The question of whether any measures relating to former prisoners should be provided for in law arising from the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement is one that extends well beyond the specific issue of taxi licences. The Minister for Justice recently introduced the Criminal Justice Spent Convictions Bill 2012, which has been passed by the Senate and is now to come before this House. That bill provides a far more appropriate context for consideration of issues arising from the Good Friday Agreement. However, to my knowledge, no amendments relating to the Good Friday Agreement were even proposed in the Senate. In any event, I am satisfied that the provisions of the Taxi Regulation Bill are fair and balanced. Under the appeal procedure providing for in the bill, the courts can determine if there are any mitigating circumstances such that mandatory disqualification should not apply in any particular case. The courts are the best place to make these kinds of judgments, required where they would have to assess every case on an individual basis.
Dessie, Ellis.
New taxi regulations could result in disqualification or suspension of drivers who had convictions relating to the conflict between Republicans and the British state on this island. This conflict was recognised as a special circumstance, and that those who receive convictions in the course of the conflict should not be treated as common criminals. There are currently drivers who were convicted of offences covered by Schedule 1 and 2 of the bill who are operating licences without any issue for years. These convictions were directly related to their involvement in the conflict, and this was recognised in a number of international agreements signed up to by this state, including the Good Friday Agreement. It would appear that legislation retrospectively affecting an individual's rights, which in this case would be to disqualify a licensed taxi driver who may have relied on these rights, such as by investing in his taxi or leaving another job to become a taxi driver, would be disproportionate and repugnant to our Constitution.
Question, please.
The questions are coming. In any consideration as to an individual's constitutional rights, such as the right to a livelihood or property rights, the doctrine of proportionality would apply. Cox v Ireland, the Supreme Court considered S34 of the Offences Against the State Act, which provided that state employees convicted of a scheduled offence in the Special Criminal Court should forfeit pension, superannuation allowance or gratuity earned for service done before their conviction. The Supreme Court determined that while the state was entitled to take into consideration the public interest of peace and order, Section 34 was disproportionate, as it bore no relation to any question of public peace.
Deputy, I'd like to call you again for a second question.
I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask a number of questions. But I agree, and I'm asking a lot of questions in regards to, number one, has the Minister looked at this bill properly? We have sought legal advice in regards to this, and we believe it's unconstitutional. What legal proofing did you do of this? The Department of Justice you mentioned, and your government has signed up, our governments here have signed up to the Good Friday Agreement, and this is putting a disproportionate pressure on families who have signed up to the Good Friday Agreement, and this should be taken into account in any consideration when it comes to offences.
Thank you, Deputy.
And
I'll come back to you, Deputy, when the Minister replies.
Thank you, Oscar Hirlock, and thank you, Deputy. And you've raised this issue previously. This bill is proportionate. I have stated to the Deputy previously that I believe the form or the period where he should be raising this issue is probably in a different piece of legislation. But having said that, he's asked, have we checked this out legally and rigorously? Of course we have. The Attorney-General has obviously went through this legislation and is quite satisfied with the drafting of this legislation and the manner in which it's been put forward and the proportional nature of it in particular. I also want to point out that the Department of Justice were very much represented on the Tax Review Committee that made these provisions that are now being enacted through the legislation and informed on that. Simply put, we've got to get to a stage where we can be very confident that anyone who's driving a vehicle, anyone who's driving a taxi, should be behind the wheel of a taxi. I'm sure everyone agrees with that. I certainly believe it. I think it's absolutely imperative that we acknowledge that the majority of taxi drivers are hard-working, decent, honourable people. However, it is amazing the amount of people who have come to me and said they didn't believe or didn't understand how somebody with a serious conviction could be allowed to get a licence. That is not acceptable. They shouldn't be allowed to get a licence. Now, I don't care whether they're claiming to be reformed, reformed from any various different serious convictions. You cannot and should not have a licence to drive a taxi if you have a conviction for murder, for terrorism, for serious sexual crime. It's as simple as that.
Thank you,
and I think that the House should support that fully. Thank you.
Final question, Deputy Ellis.
I think, Minister, the governments have signed up to the Good Friday Agreement here. They've signed up to agreements. It's an international agreement where people who took part in a conflict would be treated in a certain way, and that is something that should be binding. The pressure that this has put on people who have been in the taxi industry for many years, the fact that you are looking at this retrospectively is the problem here. There is no need to be looking. I understand the point in terms of serious convictions, but we're talking about a certain section of people that we've moved forward. What are you trying to do? Turn the clock back?
Yep.
To throw people out on the streets who have signed up to an agreement? Many of them at personal risk to themselves have signed up to the agreement. And on the basis of what you're saying, I would not be in this House because I have been involved in the conflict. So therefore, and there will be others, including in your own party. Yeah. So there would be others in the same boat. So I'm saying to you, yeah, it is very unfair, and I have legal advice to say that. I'm going to hand you the legal advice so you can have a peruse over it, and hopefully you will look at this then.
I have to call the Minister. Final reply on this, Minister.
Thank you, Oscar Hirlock. I have got a good form of correspondence on this issue, and I will take any further correspondence the Deputy wants to send me. But I stand over the following. The reason that this is retrospective is, put simply, is that there are people driving taxis in this country who shouldn't be behind the wheel of taxis. It's as simple as that. It needs no further explanation. That's why it has to be retrospective. And I don't believe that anybody in this House who has a loved one would be happy to be that they would be getting into a taxi with somebody who has a very serious conviction, whether that be for murder, terrorism, or sexual assault. And I want to put an end to that day, and I want to support this House to do so, and I believe we will do so. We can no longer continue. Thank you.